here today. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about the statewide housing study that our firm did. This was sponsored by the NC Chamber Foundation, NC Realtors, and the state's North Carolina's Home Builders Association. I have a great affinity for North Carolina. I'm from Ohio, but if my wife would agree to move here, I would be here in a heartbeat. So one of the benefits of doing this study was my wife was with me a lot for the presentations. I've done about 15 presentations in the last 8 weeks. My wife has accompanied me on most of these trips. So she has gotten to see a lot of North Carolina. So I am so close. I am so close to getting her to agree to move here. When I flew in, yesterday, came from Columbus, Ohio. I had a connecting flight in Atlanta. And there were two ladies in line. This is a true story. There were two ladies in line in front of me. And we're getting on a flight to Raleigh, and both ladies were from the Raleigh area. And I said, well, I'm from Ohio. I'd like to live, I say it all the time. I'd like to live in North Carolina. And so they started talking about why they like Raleigh, right? All the wonderful things about North Carolina. I said, well, that's interesting you say that. I want to move here too. And I got to convince my wife to do that. And the one lady, the younger lady of the two, she goes, we're closed. We're not taking anybody else. And so that's a good example, right? You have somebody that's not from here that wants to be here for many, many reasons. But then you have somebody that's here, and in fact, the lady that spoke to me that said, the words were, we're closed, is what she said. North Carolina's closed to anybody else. She's not from here. She came to this state 10 years ago from New Mexico, but she's here now, but I don't want anybody else here with me, right? We all hear that all the time. So the benefit of this study here today, the findings I'm going to present, and it's a big study, there's a lot of stuff we had in it. I can't present it all. But the benefit of this is to help understand where is North Carolina today in terms of the people that are here? And then how's that expected to change over the next 5 years? What does that mean for housing? What's today's housing stock look like now? But then what should it look like a few years from now? So let's get into it. It's a little bit hard to see with the background here, but the scope of the work, we had a lot of demographics, economic information in this report. And because it's a housing study, we looked at rental and for sale housing supply. We looked at building permit activity. And then one of the things I did at the end, and I'll show you here, is we have housing gap numbers, meaning what is the shortage of housing? Now, it does not mean that you're going to build all these units. The numbers are large, right? Beyond what the state could ever produce. But what it's going to show you is there's a lot of things behind housing. It's not just the growth. You have a lot of growth, so that drives a lot of the housing needs. But you have other factors that contribute to the housing challenges that the state faces. And so I'll talk about that a little bit. And we have data on all 100 counties. If anybody wants to access the report here, I don't have it in the slide. But if you go to the NC Chamber Foundation website, or you go to NC Realtors website, you can get the study there. On NC Realtors website, they actually have a profiles of every county that we provided for them. So again, if you just care about your one or two counties, you would have data for just that. To help you out. All right, here we go. So the study has a lot of population and demographic data. I'm going to focus, I think, almost exclusively on households. I do that because households drive demand for housing. So again, population matters, and we have all kind of good data point on population. But I want to talk about households. And I was asked as part of this presentation, even though it's the whole state, I was asked to look at the 5 counties of Chatham, Durham, Johnston, Orange, and Wake counties. So I'll talk about those repeatedly through these slides. So you're growing. This is projected growth percent change from 2024 to 2029. Darker the blue, the greater the growth. Anything in pink and red is a decline. And I'm gonna add this real quick. I did a presentation last fall at High Point University, and I had a map just like this. And I was trying to describe the different blues. This shade of blue means this. And I was trying to describe one of the lighter blues, and somebody yelled out, Tar Heel blue. I was like, oh, okay. So Tar Heel blue means this. And then I thought I would be clever. That totally backfired. And I go, oh, okay. And so the dark blue, Duke Blue Devil blue, and there was not a single laugh in that room. So I wrote notes. I do, because I always write notes after I'm done. It's like things I should do better. I was like, never reference universities when you don't know the rivalry and how the audience is going to respond. All right, so your 5 counties, you know this. You have been growing. You're expected to grow. Numbers-wise, Wake's expected to add about 41,000 households. But it's Johnston County that will see the greatest percentage growth, about 12.2%. So a lot of growth in this particular region of these 5 counties. You can see some parts of the state declining. This is the change in households, number and percent of households by age groups. The light blue is 2024, dark blue is 2029. Under age 35, you're going to grow some, adding about another 11,000 households. 35 to 54, a little bit more growth, 42,000 households. But look at the big change. Not a surprise, it shouldn't be. Whereas that age group is expected to grow by 8% or another 164,000 households. Now, some of that will be people that move here, right? Patrick Bowen's over age 55. So I might be one of those people in the next 5 years that's in that number. But some of that's people that are already here. They're just aging in place. They were age 51 or something in the year 2024, so they're going to age in place and go into that next age group. Regardless, you're going to see this significant shift for older households. And that's going to drive the demand for certain housing product. And that's the whole objective of this study. What do we need? What type of housing? What kind of rent levels or home prices? But certainly for age groups, this will be a significant factor as the state moves ahead. All right, this is percent change for each one of the counties across the state of those that are under age of 35. Again, this is 2024 to 2029. You can see your 5 counties on the bottom left. With the exception of Durham, 4 of the 5 counties are going to grow, which is surprising. I think that was one of the things that caught me off guard, that Durham was declining. But watch when I show you the next slide of the age group of 35 to 54, who's growing the most? What's Durham? So a lot of that's telling me that while this age group is expected to decline in households, a lot of them is going to age in place. They're just moving into the next age group. They're not leaving the area. They're just shifting into the next age group. But nonetheless, this type of growth will affect what type of housing people are looking for. So there you can see Durham, this is the 35 to 54 age group. Durham leading the way by far in terms of how this age group is going to grow. But all the counties will see some kind of positive growth in this particular region. 55 and older, a lot more darker blue or middle shade blues. Johnston County leading the way. And then how about renter households? This is statewide numbers. This is renter households by income level. Again, light blue is the 2024 numbers, dark blue is 2029. Where's all the renter household growth expected statewide? It's that household group, again, not individual incomes, individual people, it's households. So households that make $50,000 or more is where all the growth is expected. So that in itself is going to drive what type of rental housing is needed. Now, one of the things I caution folks is that on the fact that you have lower income numbers declining, part of that is just, again, over time, people's incomes are expected to climb. You could have 2 individual, let's just say millennials, traditional marriage, a husband and wife, and so their individual incomes, right, but they're marrying together to become a household that maybe individually they both made $40,000, but now that they're married, they make $80,000. Some of that's just that combination of things that are expected to happen, where those two people were here, they didn't leave the area, they just came together and their incomes combined, and they got shifted up to these higher income households. But regardless, so the lower income households projected to decline, you still have a need for affordable housing. I'll talk about that in a second. This is homeowners. Again, where's all the growth expected? Generally those that make $75,000 or more statewide. All right, this is median household income change. Just wanted to get some understanding of is income growing somewhere faster than other areas? And not necessarily. I think most counties across the state are expected to increase by double digits in terms of percentage change. And you can see on the bottom left there, very close in terms of where the income growth is expected. But that in itself, again, will drive what type of housing is needed across the state and in this particular region. Now, one of the things, let me see if I have, yeah, I'm going to back up here. So one of the things I didn't put in here, but was actually absolutely critical to the study, right? And in fact, I asked my staff about 20 minutes ago to give me these numbers. So one of the things that we factored in, because household growth, obviously, the more growth you have, you're going to need more housing, but there's other things. And one of the things that we factored in is people that live in substandard housing, whether it's overcrowded housing. And believe it or not, in North Carolina and all over the United States, we have people that live in units that lack complete indoor plumbing or kitchen facilities. So however you cut it up, whatever group you look at, these are people that live in what's called substandard housing. This is below modern day living standards. They're housed, but they're not adequately housed. And so we factored that in. Not all of them, but in North Carolina, You have 128,000 households that live in substandard housing. Another thing that we looked at, this will probably surprise you, we looked at people that are severe cost burden households, meaning people that pay over 50% of their income towards their housing cost. I'm going to venture to say there's not a single person in this room that's paying over 50%, maybe, but highly unlikely. But yet, you have almost 500,000 households in this state that pay over half of their income towards their housing costs. So that leaves them very little left over to spend. If you don't care about housing, but you care about economics, you got to care about housing. Because the more people put towards their housing, the less they've got to be able to spend at your stores, at your restaurants, and for other essentials that they might need. So you're losing out on opportunity to put money back into the economy because people keep putting this money into housing. 500,000 households, severe cost burden, that is phenomenal. So that was factored in. I don't have a slide for that. Projected growth, this comes from, I think, your state economic development office, 2023 to 2029. Where's most of the growth expected? Obviously, it's the bigger counties, Wake and Mecklenburg, but you can see where the growth is for your 5 counties, including Wake, which was the second highest in the state. So this drives demand. All right, so one of the things that we did, which was not part of the initial plan, but I was like, we've done so much work in North Carolina, and I was trying to in some way, encapsulate, well, how's the rental market doing? Because I talked about household growth, substandard housing, severe cost burden housing. But another thing that has to be part of the equation is, do we have any available units? Do we have an excess? Do certain counties have a lot of extra units? An excess of multifamily rentals, for example. So what I did was we pulled data from about an 18-month period leading up to the time we put this study together. And so in the end, we had about 2,600 properties, multifamily apartments that were part of this survey. I will tell you this, again, I'm part of a national firm, and I've seen a lot of studies. I don't think I've ever seen a housing study for a state have that big of an inventory of multifamily housing. So again, this is a good a snapshot of what the rental market looks like. So 2,600 units, 2,600 properties, 325,000 units, about 16,000 vacant, occupancy rate of 95%. Again, these are just the overall numbers, vacancy rate of 5%. Where do you want to be? Is that good or bad? Is that high? Is that low? That's where you want to be. You want to be about 4 to 6%. You want vacancies. Again, property owners, developers don't want that. But for a healthy market, you want vacancies, right? As life changes, people get married, people have kids, seniors want to make changes from maybe downsizing or whatever it might be. How about people relocating to the state or to a particular county? You want vacant units. So again, if you are at 4 to 6%, you're where you want to be. The state is where it needs to be, but you have a lot of household growth expected, so you're going to need to keep adding to this inventory to stay at this level. Now, the only other thing I wanted to mention real quick is we did break it out by market rate, meaning it's just unrestricted rentals versus tax credit, and the low-income tax credit program really varies across the state, but under that program, that serves households about, I want to say about 50, for your area, it's about households that make about $50,000 to $95,000 a year. Okay, so that's that segment. And then lower is the government subsidized, so anything generally under $50,000. So basically, as you go down that table, it becomes more affordable serving lower income households. So what you want to look at is the vacancy rate. Market rate, 6%, still good, but look at tax credit and government subsidized housing. There's very little available. And I'll show you some details on the level of pent-up demand of people trying to get into that housing. And that's a critical thing to understand, because one of the things I showed you in one of the earlier slides is the decline in renter households for the lower income households. So the natural reaction could be that people say, well, then why do we need more affordable housing? This group of people that's declining. They don't have much to choose from, and I just mentioned some of the housing challenges that these folks have living in substandard housing, severe cost burden housing. Nobody wants to live in a substandard housing unit, but that's all they can afford. Nobody wants to pay more than half of their income, but that's all they have to choose from in many cases. And so, again, lack of available housing, particularly in these lower income, for housing that's affordable to lower income households, creates other housing challenges. All right, so this is the overall multifamily vacancy rate across the state. The darker the blues, the higher the numbers. And so you can see where the vacancy rates are for each of your 5 counties. You can see Chatham at the highest and Johnston right behind it. The other 3 counties, kind of where you need to be for market rate rentals. But I'm going to show you why the Chatham and Johnston in particular are the way they are. All right, so it's the market rate side. So there were 4 counties in the state that had unusually high vacancy rates, over 15%. So it was Davie County, Hoke, down in the kind of the southern part of the state, and then again Chatham and Johnston counties. Those counties, Johnston at 17.9, Chatham at 22.5. That's a lot. But what that is when our staff, again, this is my staff calling 2,600 properties across the state and doing very detailed interviews. The amount of data we have is mind-boggling. But just the basic data, just to present here today, is we collected this information on these properties. Those 2 particular counties, and actually all 4 that are in the darker blues in the state, those are projects that were opened recently when we surveyed them. So they just opened up 200 units. We surveyed them a month after they opened, so they had a lot of extra vacant units. And so every case, for the most part, for those 4 counties, those higher vacancies is just because it was the time we surveyed those properties. They had a lot of units. They had just opened. With the amount of growth of those 4 counties, and particularly your 5 counties that you have in this region, you've got so much growth, you need those units. The only cautionary thing is for developers or investors of real estate, particularly market rate housing in those counties, watch the market, because there's, again, you have a lot of vacancies. Growth should take care of those things, but you have a lot of pipeline coming too. So again, just watch those markets, and there's different metrics you can look at that would kind of flag to you to say, okay, maybe this market's reaching a point that it's being overbuilt. I don't think that's the case now. And again, with all the growth, I think you're okay for a while, but watch these markets closely. So market rate wait list. Again, we put on the graph there which counties have the biggest wait list. Actually, all the counties that have wait lists for market rate rentals. And then you can see your 5 counties. 4 of the 5 have wait lists of some level for market rate rentals. And even though Johnston County doesn't have any, Johnston County's occupancy rate is incredibly high. And so there's good demand for market rate rentals in some degree, some pent-up demand. Wake County, by the way, was the highest of all the counties in the state in terms of market rate wait list. Just keep in mind, we didn't survey every single property in the state nor in these 5 counties, but we got a large majority of them. So nonetheless, there's significant pent-up demand. I want to show rents real quick of the market rate rentals. This is 1 bedroom, 1 bath, median rents. And so you can see kind of consistent across each of the 5 counties. Still some of the higher ones in the state. And then as I do as a 2 bedroom, 1 bath, a little bit more disparity now with Orange and Wake County with some of the higher rents. So again, if anybody wanted to reach out to me, it's not going to be in the study, but if you were looking at a particular county and you're like, Patrick, I want to see all the market rate properties in this particular county, I can put a zip file together and get you everything we have. There's no charge for that. So if you want to dive deeper into data, we have that data. The study, there was a point where we had to stop in terms of what we included in it. All right, so this is the tax credit rentals, again, statewide, and I put a really broad number up there that this type of housing generally serves households that make about $32,000 to $62,000 a year. But as I said a few minutes ago, in your area, that's actually closer to about $50,000 to $95,000 a year. But again, just to kind of give a broad perspective in terms of what this segment serves. This is the vacancy rates for the county, so 45 counties out of, I think, the 65 that had tax credit properties that we surveyed. 45, there's nothing available. You can see in your 5 counties, all your vacancy rates are really low, particularly in Orange and Chatham counties. But even at the highest, at Durham at 3.2, that's still below where you want to be. So there's still insufficient housing, tax credit housing in all 5 of these counties, including Durham. By the way, so it's Durham, right? So I was on my airplane flight yesterday from Atlanta to here. The stewardess it was her first time ever being a stewardess. And so they were making a big deal about it. And she goes, okay, folks, we're going to be flying into the Raleigh-Durham area. And I was like, okay, that's probably one of the things they should make sure she pronounces her cities correctly. All right, so this is the tax credit wait list. The graph showing a lot of the counties and how big those wait lists are. Mecklenburg with by far the largest, but Wake is close behind it, 3,600. You can see that the 5 counties here in this particular region, almost all the wait list is here in Wake County, but there's still pent-up demand for affordable housing in the other 4 counties. All right, government subsidized housing. So this is again I put $32,000 up here. as a broad number for the state, because it does vary from county to county, but in your area it's about 50,000 or less. And now you can see here, out of a roughly, I think it was 63 counties or so, maybe close to 70, the number of counties that have vacancies within certain ranges. And so you can see 48 counties had nothing available. And everybody, with the exception of one of the counties that had subsidized product, had a vacancy rate in that 4 to 6 range where you want to be. So everybody else was below that. So the point is, and one of the things we didn't do in the study, but if I were to study an individual county or a couple counties, one of the things that we do look at is the workers and their wages that they make, and then the corresponding housing costs. And I'll just say this has to be true. We've done it for a lot of counties in North Carolina, but I suspect this is true for pretty much the whole state. And that is, there is an absolute mismatch between the wages that the bulk of the workforce, in most jobs, retailers, cashiers, people working in restaurants, hotels, a lot of the things that we all use, those workers, their wages don't enable them on their own to be able to reasonably afford what's typically offered as a rental in the respective markets across the state. And so we do have that data for about 20-something counties that I was asked to look at that for. So again, depending on your role and the things you're looking at, if you want to understand specifically to your county, your workforce and what they earn, and then what they can afford, and then how does that match up with housing, I can get you that data, which could be very powerful, again, if you're going in front of elected officials, or you're an elected official trying to make a case to your citizens, your constituents, to say, look, housing and economics, they tie together, and this is impacting our workers. One other thing I'll mention, again, was not part of this study. It was part of a regional study that we did as a smaller region of North Carolina, is we interviewed employers. We've probably surveyed about 2,000 employers in the last 2 years. So again, trying to think about a discussion and how do we move the discussion forward for housing. And again, I'm not advocating affordable housing. I'm just, again, sharing information with y'all. We surveyed employers across the country, many here in North Carolina. We asked a bunch of questions, but one of the questions we asked is housing adversely impacting your business? And depending on what market we're in, 30, 40, 50% of the employers say, yeah, this is a problem for me to run my business. And we ask them, what is the problem? Number one, attracting workers, right? They can't because of, specifically to housing. There's many reasons why workers won't go to a particular location, to a particular business if they get a job offer. It's the housing. It's the housing cost. You're going to see some of that here in a second for the for sale housing. Lack of available housing. All right, you've seen it on the for sale side, particularly for the workforce. Lack of available housing. And so these are holding back a lot of employers from being able to attract workers. But the other one that's climbing the charts in terms of the answers we get is retaining workers. Every year I do this survey, that number keeps climbing and climbing and climbing. So it wasn't about it's not just about attracting workers, it's about holding on to the workers you've got. And that's becoming a bigger challenge for employers. And so I'll stop there on that. We've got a lot of good information. Again, if somebody's trying to educate whomever, I can share with you the surveys that we've done of residents around the country, employers, stakeholders. So I've got a lot of data that would help you educate others to try to convince them, why does housing matter? Why are we having this conversation? All right, the wait list, substantial. Again, I think for the tax credit, I'm gonna back up. Oh, there it was, 24,000 statewide. And that, again, we didn't survey everything of the tax credit housing. So 24,000 households waiting to get into tax credit housing, almost 18,000 waiting to get into government subsidized housing. You can see your wait list for your 5 counties. Orange was the only county that didn't have any households waiting to get into subsidized housing, but I can assure you there's a need for subsidized housing in all counties across the state, including your region. All right, so what's available to purchase? You know this. Right? You guys sense this, whether you're in the market, you know people, you see a news story, whatever it is. So most of your rental product, for sale housing product, you had 22,000 units when we pulled this stuff, probably late summer, fall of last year. 22,000 homes available to purchase. Most of those homes, majority of them, were priced over $400,000. Another 20% priced between $300,000 and $400,000. So almost 3/4 of your housing is priced over $300,000. And look on the other end, just about 10% was priced under $200,000. So what the price of a kind of a typical first-time home buyer home, there was a time just a few years ago that was probably just under $200,000. Today, Maybe it's 250, depending on what part of the state you're in or what part of the country you're in. But nonetheless, that inventory just keeps shrinking and shrinking. And so the challenge for people getting into home ownership for the first time is very limited in terms of what is available for them to purchase. All right, so this is median list price. And the one that pops out probably to everybody is Chatham, right? 802 is a median list price. But most of these counties, over $400,000. Johnston's not that far behind at 379. So you have very high home prices in this region. And no surprise, right, along the East Coast with some of the homes that are being built there and some of the costs related, so you've got higher prices there. But one of the things that caught me, and you're going to see this, so this is like that cause and effect. This would be one of those moments I'm going to point this out to you. On the western part of the state, and by the way, this study was done, all the data and research was done before Hurricane Helene hit. So this study does not factor in what the effects happened with housing on the western part of the state due to the hurricane. But nonetheless, if you see all the darker colors on the left-hand side, the western part of the state, that's going to affect what kind of housing is needed. So I'll show you that in a second as I show you ultimately the demand numbers for housing. But that's driving part of it, and that's just the lack of affordable housing in western North Carolina. But you have that same challenge here in this particular region of the state as well. Just higher priced homes that just don't match up with the bulk of the workers or the households in those particular markets. All right, so this is the available housing for your 5 counties. I don't know if the folks in that side of the room can see this. So it's lower prices on the left, higher prices on the right. Excuse me. And for each one of the counties. Now you see the color shading that's like a gradient scale that we do. That's relative to all 100 counties. So the greens would be where the higher concentrations were statewide, which also then is for the region. And then red is where it's lower for relative to the whole state. So green is where bulk of your product is. I think 4 out of the 5 counties. In this particular region, the home prices were priced over $400,000. You can see Chatham, 85% was priced over $400,000. But even Orange and Wake, that's where the large majority of available homes is priced at. And then very little priced under $200,000. And even to some degree, even priced under $300,000 is pretty limited. So this is a statewide challenge in terms of availability and affordability of this housing. This is the actual number of listings that were available. So it's no surprise, right? The bigger counties would have more housing units, more that would be available. So Mecklenburg and Wake have the highest numbers in the state, with Wake at 1,500, almost 1,600. And then you could see the numbers for the rest of the counties in your region. But what I did was I wanted to just do that as an availability rate, meaning if I take those vacant homes and compare that to all owner-occupied housing, what's that relationship? So it's like a vacancy rate, but you can be in a housing unit to sell it, and so it's not vacant, so it's availability rate. And it just so happens all 5 of your counties are at 0.5%. For for-sale housing, again, you want vacancies for a healthy market. So for homeowners, developers, these are good numbers to be this low. But like rentals, you want it to be 4 to 6% available or vacant. For the availability rate for for sale, you want that to be about 2 or 3%. So you're at a quarter of where at minimum of where you need to be in terms of having a good, balanced, healthy inventory of for sale housing. And it's universal. I mean, the highest in the state was Avery County up in the northwestern part at 4.7%. I think every other county, virtually every other county was below 2% with just a couple other exceptions. So lack of available housing. Statewide, I put the number 22,000 units. If I, again, compare it with all owner-occupied housing, statewide, your availability rate is 0.8%. So statewide, you're about half of where you need to be. So you need more for-sale housing. You need more rental housing. All right, so now I'll get into the final part. These are the housing gaps. So we did it over a 5-year period, 2024 to 2029. Did it for renters and owners. And I did it by these different percentages of area median income. For most people in this room, that might be irrelevant or you don't know what that is, but simply because there's a lot of housing programs that are tied to percent of median income. So anything at 50% or lower would be government subsidized housing programs. At 51 to 80 is generally the low income tax credit program. And then anything higher than that would be more traditional market rate. So basically it's more affordable stuff is the lower percentage, and then the higher percentages would be higher income households and then corresponding higher priced product or rentals. We do the gaps for each one of the counties, and then we have the state numbers. And then I do it as a number and a ratio, and I'll show you what that means and what that looks like and why that matters. All right, so for the folks in the back of the room might, again, on this side of the room, might have a tough time seeing this. In the end, I marked in the red box on the right the gaps for the state. Now, again, these numbers are big, and we're going to feel daunting. It's like, is that our short? Do we need to build that many units? 322,000 rental units, 442 for sale housing units? No, because not all of that is people needing a house, like household growth. Again, some of that could be replacing existing stock. Some of that is just if we could repair some of the existing housing stock. We can make housing more affordable to folks through vouchers or whatever it might be. But nonetheless, you have about 764,000 gap over the next 5 years. And then we break it out by those different income levels, and I'm going to show you what that looks like for each one of the areas. All right. So I do the housing gaps as numbers, first off. So again, we're looking at growth, substandard housing, all these things that we look at goes into the model. And so no surprise, right? Where it's the bigger parts of the state, Mecklenburg and Wake, they had the biggest numbers, over 100,000 units. They're short for the next 5 years. And then you can see it drops off noticeably, but Guilford, Durham, Forsyth, places like that, still over 25,000 housing units short. So if I didn't look at any data, but I know the state as I do, it's 1 year ago, I'd say, Patrick, where's the highest gaps? I'm going to start, it's going to be Mecklenburg, it's going to be Wake, right? Because it's the biggest areas. So that's somewhat helpful to you to know how big those numbers are. But everybody would have a general conclusion of bigger markets, that should be where the biggest need is. Okay, so I did that. But what I wanted to also do was do it in one other way, and that's the right side of this, where I did it as a ratio, simply meaning if I take the gap, and I'll just take Lee County, 7,100 units. So if I take that gap, that's the shortage that they have, and I compare that to all households in that county, what's that relationship? In their case, it's 26%. So its gap, 7,100, is well below Mecklenburg, Wake, Guilford, all these other counties, but proportionately, they're on par with some of these bigger places. So what this enables people to understand is, like, don't forget about smaller communities. Don't forget about rural North Carolina, that they are feeling the same proportional problems as some of the biggest markets in the state. So you're going to see now in a second, I'm going to show you these ratios, and you'll see totally different numbers when I show you the number of units, but I flip it over to ratio, the story switches. And that's an important story for us all to understand. All right, so this starts again, overall gaps. I'm going to break this out by renters and owners in a second. The bottom left, you can see your region's numbers. Wake at 110,000. Chatham at the smallest at 12,000, but still a big number relative to other counties in the state. Now as I do it a ratio, again, back up. Not a lot of dark blue or blues on here. Now as I flip it over to a ratio, now you can see other parts of the state are starting to pop up, like a Watauga County, which is Boone area. We're down in the southeast part of the state, Brunswick, places like that, western North Carolina. You start to see other parts of the state that maybe aren't big areas, but proportionally they're going through some significant housing demand. So again, Chatham, their number was the smallest, but their ratio is, I think, one of the biggest in the states. So proportionally, Chatham's got a big housing challenge ahead of it. So these are rental gaps across the state. Again, by those different area median income levels, lowest income households are on the left, highest incomes on the right. So where's the greatest need? It's for the lowest income households, but you can see the numbers are really big for just about every one of those income levels. So these are the rental gaps, number of units needed. You can see your 5 counties on the bottom left. You can see on the map itself, where are those gaps the biggest? Wake and Mecklenburg, but even like Asheville region, along the I-40 corridor, heading down to Wilmington in the southeast, and no surprise, right? These are bigger areas, growth and other things that are happening. Now watch, this is really stunning. And I'll point out to the western part of the state, those 8 counties that are west of Buncombe County, Asheville area, really light numbers. I think the biggest number over there was about 1,100 units. Everybody else less than 1,000 units gap. But watch as I do this as a ratio, proportionally. What's their need? Dramatic difference. Western North Carolina, and I'm just doing that as an example, it's easy to spot on the map, but you can see how much of the state, I think those ratios are over, it's like 18%, something like that, anything in the dark blue. And you could see your part of the state, 4 of your 5 counties have significantly high ratios in terms of the rental gap. So then we did the same thing for sale housing. Where's the greatest gap? Now it's more towards the moderate to higher income households. And I'll show you at the very end here, I'll show you, because again, those percentage of AMIs, it might be hard to comprehend. What does that mean? I'll show you what that means in terms of rents and home prices. But for now, where's the greatest gaps? You can see they are for sale over that 5-year period. All right, so then that's the numbers, the gaps. Again, bigger places have the bigger numbers, but you can see your region, Wake leading the way. Nothing smaller than 6,100 at Orange County. But still, this particular region of the state has some of the bigger gaps in terms of for sale housing. Which, by the way, like all of these shortages, gaps for our housing, it could feel daunting and discouraging, but let's flip it and talk about opportunity and potential. My goodness, there is incredible potential. If I was a developer, I would be all over the state, but I'd be all over this particular area because there's a lot of great opportunity for both rentals and for sale housing. And I hope that's one of the outcomes of this study, is that you get particular developers to come in and do the type of housing is needed. Again, I'm going to back up. That's the number. Now as I switch it over to those ratios, a lot different. A lot more counties now show up on the radar that if I hadn't done this, everybody would be thinking, let's just go to Wake, let's go to Mecklenburg, let's go down to New Hanover County, let's go to Buncombe. These are the areas that are growing and have all the people. But there's other parts of the state that absolutely need housing, and that's the point of this particular analysis. All right, so there's no way you folks can read this. I know that, okay? And that wasn't the point. I actually thought about cutting this up for each one of the counties. But I decided not to because I think this is a good way to kind of compare you all. So this is each one of the 5 counties in your region. Left-hand side is the lowest income households. Far right-hand side is the higher income households. I do the renter gaps, which are anything I marked in the red. Again, it goes across that whole row. But I marked in red the highest gap for each one of the counties for rentals in red. And so it's the same story for your 5 counties. It's the lowest income households with the greatest need. But with that said, if you go across that go to the right, you still have shortages of all types of housing, rental housing at all affordability levels. So there are opportunities for developers to do moderate to higher market rate rental product. But again, the greatest shortage is for that lowest income households. In some cases, it's really close. I'm trying to think of one. Okay, so we'll take, again, might be tough to see, but Durham County, this is the second grouping on there. Biggest need, 4,600 for the rental units, but not that far behind. You get over to the 81 to 120% of median, it's 4,300. So it's really close. So there's a need for the lowest income households, but even some of these higher income households. Again, for the folks on this side of the room, you probably can't see it. I do have the corresponding incomes, and then I have the corresponding rents, as then I show the gaps. So again, for the Chatham County, the lowest income, the biggest gap is for the lowest income households making up to about $31,000. They can afford a rent of $794. And we did the same thing for the for sale housing, where we show the actual, that's the incomes and then the corresponding home prices. So at that point, you can start to see the exact rents and home prices for this type of shortage. For the for sale housing, I marked those in green. So where's the greatest needs? It's either in that 81 to 120% of median income, which is roughly people that make about 84 to 150,000-ish. And then the next highest is that 121% to 150% of median. And again, those would be people that make about 127 to about 183,000 roughly for the region. So that's where the bulk of the gap is, the shortage. That's where the opportunities are, the needs are, the development potential is for those particular counties. But again, there's a need for the most part for all types of housing across the entire spectrum of affordability, both rentals and for sale. All right, so in the end, it's kind of hard to write recommendations, and I wasn't really asked to dive deep into any kind of recommendations or strategies. But I put on here just some things, big picture things, educate the public, including decision makers, and about the housing challenges, characteristics, and so forth. So we're doing that here today. Today is my, I would say, about 15th presentation in the last 2 months. I've got one this afternoon, and that'll be kind of it for a while. So if anybody knows any group that really maybe should hear this data, let me know. I'd be glad to come and speak or do something virtual if you'd like me to do that. So educating the public, educating elected officials, decision makers about housing, it's an important part of the process. You can look at a lot of different other states and communities to see how they approach things. We've seen a lot of good things done, and we've seen some mistakes along the way that communities have done. Support efforts not only just to do new housing, but I do think part of the discussion has to be in this state and all across the country is how do we preserve what we have, right? So that's a big part of the discussion that needs to be had. Encourage local housing advocates to build organizational community capacity. The speaker that's coming up after me, Ben Stevens, he and I were talking about that before I got up here today, and I said, Ben, one of the things I think is a major thing that's holding communities back, it's not, look, we got a big problem in the country with housing. And for some of the bigger cities, there is, when I say infrastructure, I'm talking not about water and sewer, I'm talking about people and organizational infrastructure, capacity. Some cities have that, right? Some cities have housing advocacy groups, coalitions, task force, somebody pushing things forward so that people understand, wait, we need to do something about housing. Where, in my opinion, where the challenge that North Carolina and much of the country faces is rural parts of the nation. And the reason that is because we do a lot of individual community studies around the country, and so we go into some of these smaller communities and we do the housing needs assessment, we give them the numbers, and it's like, okay, great, we know we have this problem. We don't know where to go because they don't have staff to do it. I mean, sometimes the government offices in some of these communities are so small that they don't have the staff capacity to do it, nor do they have the expertise and knowledge. And so that's one of the things that I think people need to think about is how do we help rural America, rural North Carolina, to figure out how do we get them the resources that they can move the housing discussion forward. Because I will tell you this, I mean, I've gone in some very conservative communities that they didn't want to touch housing, they got other priorities, let the free market take care of this. But then when they start to see some of this data, and particularly when they start to see the impact of employers, right, then they start to rethink housing. When they start to see the impact on the workforce and the challenges that they face, then they start to rethink housing. And I've literally stood in front of county commissions who didn't want to touch housing, and by the time I got done, they're like, okay, I think one of the quotes I got was, we need to get off the sidelines. We got to do something about housing. That's great, because I genuinely believe they want to do something, not just that county, but many counties. They just don't have the capacity to do it. So we do need to have that discussion to think, how can we help these smaller communities? And then lastly, leveraging data from this study to encourage and attract residential development. I'm sure you all aren't having too much trouble to attract development in your area, but there are parts of the state that do. And some of that is and that's one of the fundamental pieces. Again, I had no agenda. I was just trying to think, how do I inform people the right way? And that's why we have those housing gap ratios. Because for the most part, I'm not a developer, but I work with a lot of them. They're looking at numbers. Where are we growing? Where's the high growth areas? I'm going to go into those areas. Where do I get the highest rents? Where can I get the highest home prices? That's fair. They should chase that. But it's rural parts of the country that are kind of getting forgotten, and no one's looking at those numbers and looking at the potential. There's tons of stuff I could share with you. If I was a developer, I'd be looking at other data sets that people don't look at that would show you this, you got to go here. This is the place to go. Nobody's thinking about it because it's just not growing a lot, but it's poised to grow. So there's a lot of cool things that can be done. But one of the best things, the easiest things to do, right? This is part of it, just talking to you all. There's a lot of good stuff. I know that NC Realtors, they're being pretty progressive in trying to think ways of how do we get more information out there. So I'm talking with them about some other things they can do. But that really is part of this, right? We've got to share information, educate people so that we can start to really address housing and come up with some solutions. All right, so I put at the bottom there just some basic resources. These are really great. The Housing Supply Accelerator Playbook, which was done by the American Planning Association, which the executive director or president, I can't remember her title, Sue Schwartz, who's over in the Greensboro area, actually heads this. And so they came up with this really good document that if you didn't know anything about housing, or you just knew a little bit, but you wanted to get in and start to understand what are other communities doing, great resource. Because they're going to explain some of these initiatives, strategies, things like that, and then give you examples around the country of who's done what. So good example. And the same thing for local housing solutions. That's the Housing Accelerator Playbook on steroids. That thing is so incredibly comprehensive, a lot of good resources there. And again, going through different initiatives, policy things, other things that can be done to address housing. And then again, they give examples of around the country, who's doing what's working. So 2 really good resources. And the same thing for Change Lab Solutions. I put that up there as another good resource. So there's resources out there. And the good thing is, bad thing is the country's going through a housing crisis. The good news is everybody's trying something, right? So there's many examples around the country that you can look at to see what works. We've done over 100 of these housing needs assessments. Again, not too many on the state level, but certainly for individual communities. So if you wanted to talk with me, or again, my contact information actually is coming up. I'll just put it up here now. That's my contact information. If you were curious about a certain initiative or a community that's going through something specific, hey Patrick, our community's thinking about pursuing A, B, and C. Have you ever seen that before? Can you put us in contact with somebody that's done that? I will tell you, look, communities want to help each other because they are going through it and they can learn from you and vice versa. So I know communities that would want to talk with somebody that was trying to pursue something that this particular community has tried. They want to talk that through and learn from each other.
Good morning. Great to be here. Appreciate the HBA's invitation. So first, a disclaimer, I'm going to be speaking to you about my views on a range of topics. They may or may not be the views of my employer. And secondly, in the room, I see a few people who I'm doing business with. I see some people who are going to be voting on a zoning case that I have before a municipality, so I'm not speaking as the applicant, or in one case as the payer of your invoice, which I apologize, it's a couple weeks late. Saw someone a minute ago. So I've given this talk behind the numbers a bunch of times, and it's sort of a crowd pleaser because I get the pro forma out and I talk through what happens when you cut a floor off a building, what happens when you sort of do affordable housing without any sort of a subsidy. But as I was talking to Patrick and Erica and sort of preparing for this talk, it's interesting, but I think in my experience, there's quite a bit of housing that doesn't come into being, not because it's not financially feasible. There is a fair amount of that, but there are probably tens of thousands of units in the Triangle that haven't come into being for reasons other than just the numbers. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the things that I talk about in Behind the Numbers. But what I really want to talk about today is behind the decisions. This is it's going to be about half original material and half the stuff that I normally cover. But I think to sort of pick up where Patrick left off, we can talk about the stats for how many housing units we lack. We can talk about the math for why some projects become financially infeasible. But what do we do then? In my experience, I personally have worked on, call it 300 to 600 units that probably could have been housing, should have been housing. The comp plan said they wanted to be housing, but for reasons that I'm going to talk about today, they didn't happen to turn into housing. And I'm one guy, and I bet there's hundreds of other cases like that. So what's going on? What are the incentives and the constraints that lead to that being the case? So I want to talk about that a bit today. I'm probably going to be focused more on the folks who are at city staff and the elected officials this morning in dialogue. And I would say, if your mission as an elected official or a staff person is to increase the bottom line of developers, then obviously you want the process to be as Byzantine and scary and complicated and expensive as possible. And developers hate competition, so obviously we would welcome that. But if it's your mission, which I hope it is, to have housing be more like food, it's something that's widely available at reasonable prices for anybody who needs it, then I think Patrick has shown that the process that we're all using to get to that housing has shortcomings. And so I want to talk about what some of those are today and try to make a case for some things that we could do. I'll tell you, sort of having been thinking about this space and spending a lot of brain cells on it for a long time, it's probably just going to get worse in most places. And I think an evolutionary process is going to take place where certain people think hard thoughts and figure out how to create solutions. And those places will sort of take the lead and other places will fall behind with economic stagnation and all sorts of other problems that Patrick outlined that come when your housing costs are too high. So let's jump in here. If any of this is interesting, as Maggie mentioned, check out The Birth of a Building. So I'm going to start with an analogy from SimCity, which anybody who's about my age probably grew up playing a bit. When, I don't know how good I am at normal SimCity, but I was great at the version I played because my cousins told me about a cheat code in SimCity called Bootamus. Anybody who hasn't heard this talk know what happened when you type Bootamus when you're playing SimCity? What happens is it adds $1 million to your account and you get an applause. And so I would boot up SimCity. I'd type Bootamus about 20 times, and then all things were possible. There was no public works project that was off the table. And so I suspect if you're an elected official or a town staff, people come to you frequently and say, why don't you do X, Y, and Z? Why? I'm coming to public comment. I'm telling you I want this thing. Why aren't you doing it? And the reason is probably because there is no Bootamus when you're actually working for the town. You have constraints that the people at public comment may not be able to fully appreciate. That's the case for everyone in this room. And that's frequently the reason when you say, why isn't something happening? Well, there are constraints. And so we're going to start this morning by talking about some of the hidden constraints in this process that lead some of those units not to be built. And then I'm going to tell you about a few of my reform misadventures. And we'll talk about sort of the nature of the standoff and my sort of big suggestion for what we can do. Let me make sure I get my clock up. Okay, so the hidden constraints really boil down to what I'm going to call supply and demand constraints. So a demand constraint is a constraint where somebody has to want this to happen in order for it to happen. So let's start at a rather strange place, the developer. You wouldn't think, oh, I have to have a developer who wants this project. Let's consider why a developer has to want a project for it to occur. So let's say you're at your company and the HR folks come in and they say, hey, we have a new 401k plan and there's two options that we want you to consider. Don't worry, they're both going to give you a 7% return. One of them is your typical Vanguard index fund. The other one also gives you a 7% return, but there are $2 million in application costs. There's a 2-year evaluation period to be approved, and you have to pledge your home as collateral. So which of these two options do you want to sign up for? Same return either way. Any reasonable person would pick the former. No one would go into a risk-adjusted position that required all of that risk for the same return. And so as you may or may not know, basically how we fund these projects is a developer is an expert in getting entitlements and designing a building, but we partner with other people who have the capital. And how that works is sort of, I'm putting in a very small amount of the equity. Someone who's investing your retirement is putting in that 38%, and then we go to a bank who has your deposits and they're putting that 60% in. But here's how it works. I put all my money in, a couple $1 million, right up front, all at risk, my cash. And then if the project looks like it's a no-brainer, the people who manage your retirement will give me the other 38%, and then we'll go to the bank. And then it comes out exactly that way. So I spend a few $1 million of cash, then the investor puts their money in, and at the end, the bank gets their money back, the passive investor gets their money back, and if there's any money left, I might get some of it. So the way that projects die feasibility-wise is not usually that there are $0. It's rather that the people who have this cash and the investors who have your retirement say, I'm looking at the risk profile of this, and while I may not make nothing, I could spend $3 million up front in 6 years of our time and end up with virtually nothing. And so a project has to not only have some money, but it has to also have enough money so that when I lose $300,000 or $400,000 in pursuit costs on a project that doesn't work, I'm not out of business. I'm not no longer a going concern. So that's a constraint. A developer has to want it. Now, the second constraint is that you have to have a capital partner. So anybody know what cross-laminated timber is? It's beautiful, right? I want to build a building out of cross-laminated timber desperately in spite of the well-known acoustic problems. So there is a site in the Triangle, and there was an RFP, and I wanted to respond to this RFP, and I wanted to build a cross-laminated timber building, and so I called one of my investors. This is a building design in the UK designed by a friend of mine, and I said, hey, this is what I want to do. What do you think? And he's like, let me ask you a few questions, Ben. Have you ever built one of these before? And I said, no, I haven't. All right. And has your designer ever built one of these before? I don't think so. Has the contractor you're going to hire ever built one of these? Also, probably not. He's like, then I don't think this is the investment for our firm. And so many ideas that might go forward because the developer's like, I'm willing to take this risk, or I love it, will die at the stage of finding the people who are investing your retirement, for whom, if they take your retirement money and they go back to you and say, hey, Bill, Kathy, we lost the money, but man, it was a cool project. It was gonna be great. The renderings would, you wouldn't believe it. That doesn't work. And so the investors are going to self-select for people who are protecting your retirement, and many ideas that even I as a developer would want to do, and I'm okay with the risk profile, they will die on the altar of making sure that we don't lose your retirement. So the next constraint is your customer. This might seem like a strange one, but I was in a meeting the other day and someone said, you should make this building nicer. I think people would like that. I think that's a direct quote. And I would like to drive an Italian supercar and fly private, but I don't. And so frequently one of the dilemmas is that as we're trying to design buildings, and the firm I work for, I think, designs some of the nicest multifamily in the nation. This is from my mood board. We know what's beautiful, but we also know that whether it's a hotel or an office building or a multifamily, that we have to build what people can afford to pay. And if we build something that vastly outstrips that, we're going to lose that building and it's going to go back to the bank. Now we're not in the game. So we're always pushing the envelope. We're finding that 80-20, what can we spend money on that really moves the needle, but it's very challenging because, as we all know, you might pay 20% more for your housing, but you probably wouldn't pay 100% more. You're probably already right on the line, right? And that's the case for virtually everyone in the country. So that customer is a limitation. What are they willing to pay? And also, I'll say, so I lived in Berlin for years, didn't have a car. I could beat a cab on the subway. We unfortunately don't have that infrastructure here. And so I'd love to build in a way that sort of depends on mass transit, reduces my parking costs, which are extraordinary, but we don't have that infrastructure. And there's also certain evolutionary psychology reasons that people for thousands of years have liked being carted around. It seems to be something deeply rooted. And so that's one of those other challenges, is building for what we have today, even though we all want this. How do we strive for it while still building things that can be financed? So a final constraint that I'll mention is the land seller. One of the most frequent things that I hear is, this is a great project, just not here. And I'll explain the constraint to you this way. I'm a developer, so I can find where anybody lives, find their information, right? That's part of the skill set. So I could say, okay, where does this gentleman here live? What's the Zillow value for his house? I'm willing to bet that in 95% of the cases, maybe more in this room, if I came to you and said, the Zillow price of your house is X dollars, here's a check for that amount, most of you would not throw the keys at me. You're not sellers. And your grandmother isn't a seller, and the people down your street aren't a seller. So the fact that it would be convenient for something to go here doesn't mean that it's possible. And so that's one of the other big constraints. So basically, in talking about these constraints, for a developer, the risk has to be enough for us to say, we're going to take this risk, we believe in it. The lenders have to find it safe enough. The users have to be able to afford it. And the landowner has to be willing to sell. I offered a lady a couple years ago, she had just paid $400,000 for a house that I needed for an assemblage. I got up to $1.2 million. She said, we're done here. Not everything is for sale. So this kills a lot of projects that we would like to see, right? And this isn't a bad thing. This is just sort of a hidden constraint. It's what's behind the curtain. So there's one person I haven't mentioned. What about the neighbors? Do the neighbors have to demand it? Well, neighbors will never demand competitive housing to their own. Even if they were in phase one, they'll come to protest phase two, right? So let's talk about supply constraints. You've all been there. Let's talk about supply constraints. So if you go to a house showing, let's say you go and 100 people show up for this showing. Your view of that turnout is entirely 101% determined by whether you own the home or you're trying to buy it. There's not an objective sort of view of housing supply and demand. The view is, am I selling it or am I buying it? If you're selling it, this is the best possible outcome, right? You're going to get an incredible price. If you're trying to buy it, it'll put you in a position of despair. And that sort of explains supply constraints. So let's think about supply constraints from the developer side. So what do developers want regarding supply constraints? Well, this is your prototypical picture of what the public thinks a developer is. Gerald Hines in his prime. Um, a developer obviously wants to be able to build housing or build whatever they're building and have it be reasonably practical to do so. But obviously, if everyone is able to do it, then there's simply no profit to be made. And this sort of seems a bit jaded or Machiavellian, but it's probably the same view that you have of your own job, right? So you're a traffic engineer, you're a land use attorney, and you have no control over how many people go into that field. You probably don't mind. The more land use attorneys, the better. But if everyone is doing that, then you're not going to be able to make a living wage, because when you go to apply for the job or you try to get a raise or you try to start your business, there's too much competition. So developers actually, I think, are thought of as the people who control supply and demand of housing, but that's actually not the case. Just like you don't control the supply of dentists or land use attorneys. So the party that controls the supply of housing, I would say, is the city. And so I look at the city sort of like the Federal Reserve. A business owner will come to you with their quarterly report and say, we're doing great, everything's going well, and they'll take credit for it when that's happening. And if everything's doing terribly, they'll blame someone else or deflect. But essentially, as the Federal Reserve floods the economy with money or takes it out, quantitative tightening, every company is going to respond. We don't control the supply of money, and therefore, when the Federal Reserve opens up the spigot, we're all going to hire more, do more research, take on more projects. When they close it down, we're going to do the opposite. Even though we think we control our destinies, they really do. So in talking about the city and how the city affects supply, we can talk about the staff and we can talk about the elected officials. So on the staff side, as I'll mention in a minute, I've been involved in quite a bit of zoning reform or zoning reform attempts, and through that process have become to be good personal friends with quite a few planners. And so I would say at the beginning of my career, I had a slightly antagonistic view of planners because I thought they had a slightly antagonistic view of me. But what I have learned is that obviously the person to whom I submit my application at the town of fill in the blank is not deputized to start the revolution. They have certain plays that they have to run. There's a framework that's in place. And so they work with me and we try to find solutions, but they don't have sort of a blank check to do whatever they want. And on the side of the elected officials, I was recently working on, not recently, a few years ago now, working on a case where the comp plan said there should be redevelopment here. I got the land tied up at an incredible price. And I met with different people in power, and they said, the comp plan says there should be housing here. It should be here. It would be great if it would be here. It's not going to be here. And they explained the political reasons why it was not going to be there. And sort of this was very frustrating to me at the time. I've cooled off from it, thankfully, but it's part and parcel of how our system is run. We have representative democracy, and so there's self-selection. If they didn't do what their voters asked them to do, they'd be out of office, and somebody would be in who did what they asked. So it always leads me to the property owners who we sort of started this section with. So imagine you own this home, and you get a flyer that there's a new development down the street. And you ask yourself, do I have any possible upside in this development? I don't have an equity position in it. I don't get to control the design, at least directly. There's really no upside for me. Is there a downside for me? Is there a possible downside? Maybe there's more traffic. Maybe there's people I don't like. Maybe it's noisy. Maybe there's something that I wouldn't like if I was smart enough to think about it, but I'm not that smart. But once it gets built, I'll curse myself and everybody else who didn't go protest against it, so we should go down there. And our default position should just be no. Now, that may not be an outcome that I like, but it's not unreasonable. And that's what you will see. You advertise about a project, 100,000 people drive by the sign, about 0.1% of them show up. And generally, it's people who are recognizing, I have no upside in this, but I have potential downside. So rationally, they are showing up to be against it. There are laws that sort of facilitate that. There are different playbooks that have sort of been evolved over time. You can vote for certain candidates, but rhetoric plays a really important part. So sort of the rhetorical playbook is this will tear the neighborhood apart. It should exist, but somewhere else. We've already covered that. It lacks character, which is never defined. If I was NIMBY consultant, which no one's ever tried to hire me for, but I guess the price was right. If I was a NIMBY consultant, I would coach you to make proposals that are mutually exclusive. So, it should be affordable but not have a lot of poor people. It should be nicer than anything in town but not luxury. And then when I fail to do that, it's on me. So, as I've said, these are sort of coherent but unsatisfying views. They're what lead to this shortage that Patrick pointed out earlier. So what do we do about it? Well, there's one party that we've left out of this. Anybody want to guess who I've left out?
Our children.
Your children. I did leave your children out, Patrick, but that's not who I was referring to. Anybody else? Buyers? Well, buyers inherently, by their definition, they want it. The party that I was thinking about is the state. And I would argue that the state, and perhaps at the federal level, has allowed the process that we're all involved in, either on the city side, the elected side, the engineering and design side, the owner side, to become sort of like a Saturday morning soccer match where, I'm on one side of the field, staff are on the other side of the field, and people on the sidelines saying, get them, stop them, which is not the dynamic that you want when you're trying to create reasonably priced, widely available stock of anything. So as Patrick illustrated, the consequences are the rents and prices go up. That means the labor costs go up. I'm giving a talk for the TVJ in September where I talk about the upward spiral of costs. 50% of construction is labor. And so if their housing cost gets more expensive, labor gets more expensive ad infinitum. So it reduces investment in the economy. It reduces tax revenues, prices people out of moving to the market. That's been one of our big competitive advantages in the Triangle. Oh, it's a lower cost place of living. We'll see how long that lasts. And the people who could fix the problem may fear the repercussions for doing so. So I normally transition at this point in the talk with Bob Ross, because it's good to check in with Bob at about this point in the talk. He was painting this picture of this winter scene, and I have no artistic talent whatsoever, but I found it really interesting. He started off by painting the whole canvas black. I would have added the black in as I went, right, and it would have looked terrible. And so I don't sit around my office thinking about the things that I've just mentioned, these hidden constraints all day, but they are the black background of the canvas. And if you don't grasp how those constraints work and how they frustrate us in our attempts to create new housing, then you'll be confused sort of by what happens. So let's say that you attend this talk and you are super fired up and you're like, man, I have seen a vision, I'm gonna be a housing reformer. You might do what a senior staffer did a few years ago when they heard me talk on a different topic. You call me up and you say, let's do it. Let's make some changes. So a gentleman who I've become good friends with called me up and he said, we want to make a zoning reform, and if you will propose it, then the staff will lead it. And I'll spare you the details. I learned recently it did actually get passed. It was around co-living, which I think is a perfectly reasonable incremental solution to naturally occurring affordable housing. I'll tell you how this worked, though. About 3 years, and I can't imagine how many thousands of hours of staff time were spent. If you apply for a special use permit, 2 additional people can live every 1,200 feet. That is the result of that measure that we sort of went off to do. And the reason is that whatever reform you as a staffer or an elected official or a citizen want to propose, it will face what has become sort of an exponential curve of existing infrastructure, code infrastructure that it has to work with. So I asked ChatGPT to help me here on the amount of sort of different code that's in place in the different municipalities. And every page of this code almost certainly has a perfectly reasonable explanation for why it's there, but it makes it hard as we attempt to make any sort of changes. We're already so encumbered by what's already in place. It's like a debt that spirals out of control. You can't make the payments. So what happens obviously now in the Triangle, rezoning is 1 to 3 years. The site plan is 1 to 2. There's a municipality in the Triangle for which you can basically pick the last 2 numbers there, count on 4 to 5 years. And I will say it's really important to understand we are here. So I used to live in Germany, and this Übersicht Bebauungspläne in Bezirken tells you that in downtown Berlin, the average time to go from application to building permit is 8.5 years. Now that's a lot faster than Neukölln, where it's 12 years, but you'll notice that Neukölln has brought down its average by 3 months, which I think is an encouraging development. So our attempts, even if you leave today very charged up to change the system, our attempts to simplify the system are sort of cut short by some of the reasonable, but simply, the huge amount of complexity that we've already sort of baked into the system. I pivoted from local reform adventures and said, no, let me just go to the state, because then any change that I advocate for will have state ramifications. I know the HBA is involved in lots of conversations there. I won't bore you talking about my laundry list. There's a few that I'm pushing for, lower lot sizes, reduction of parking mins and maxes, things like that I think make sense. But let me tell you sort of what I've learned about the nature of the standoff as I've tried to pursue these zoning reforms. There's two different positions that happen here when you try to add density, and Patrick put his hand on the third rail at the end. He was like, I would sort of suggest density. When you suggest density, in particular in North Carolina, you will get the unequivocal answer, our road system can't handle density. Here's why. In the 30s, when the FHA and other groups were starting to make loans, and increasingly in the post-war period, the people who were making the loans decided that the grid system was not bucolic, and what would be bucolic are curvy roads, and for all sorts of interesting aesthetic reasons, right? And so if you go to a town that, this is Minneapolis, southern suburbs of Minneapolis, I suspect that this town could grow just about as large as it wanted to. Minneapolis could be Tokyo, because of all the different routes that you can use to get where you're going. If you go to the Triangle, by contrast, so this is Minneapolis, this is where I live, you can understand that it would take a century for us to repair this. And I think towns are taking a lot of steps and saying, what are the cost-effective ways that we can go about this? But this is another spot. I think this is in Cary. Obviously, this is a roadblock for us trying to, pun intended, I guess, for us to add density and close the gap in housing that Patrick was alluding to. So that's the one side, and it would seem sort of like this is a checkmate, gotcha, I'm sorry, the Triangle is just not a place where we're gonna do any more density, we're closed. But the other position, the comeback is, your existing tax base can't pay the bills. I was actually at a hearing last night, and I was listening as the town manager was talking about the budget in the town, and they were talking about here are the difficult trade-offs that we're having to make, and a stream of different people came forward with perfectly good reasons why the service that they had or the role they fulfilled in the community could not possibly be cut, and towns are in a very difficult position. So you guys had Chuck Marone come, so this is a slide from his group pertaining to a community in Western North Carolina. But as I'm sure you heard in his previous lectures, at the very, very lowest densities, many of the things that we build don't cover their cost. They actually require subsidy. I won't dwell there. I think there are solutions to that problem. But for the status quo that we have with the road system doesn't seem to be able to handle a lot more density. But we're in a financial position, it seems, that we can't not add some density. We cannot not add revenue to the system. The system simply won't handle it. Now, in sharing this with you, you don't instantly have the solution to all the problems. That's background. But let me talk about a few proposals that I have. And if this was a city council meeting, this would be a working session, not an evening presentation. This is my suggestion. As somebody who's been thinking about this and attempting to do zoning reform because of my concern for the problem, may not be the perfect solution. But this is what I would do if someone was foolish enough to ask me what they should change. My main suggestion, which I would call the uber comment of uber comments in zoning reform, is that we have to fix the power vacuum. Now, what do I mean by that? Everybody know who's on these slides? These two stalwart figures of 20th century planning theory? Right. So Mr. Moses and Miss Jacobs. So what you know about the story is Robert Moses was going to run freeways through Manhattan, which would have been a terrible idea, which is accurate, and it would have set New York City and its urban fabric back who knows how long, centuries, right? Jane Jacobs mobilizes lots of protesters and rightly stops that effort and is rightly rewarded for it. I don't think a lot of people know about Robert Moses' other CV. So he built 658 playgrounds in New York City. He built Shea Stadium. He built Jones Beach State Park, which later then added an amphitheater. And he created and led semi-autonomous authorities to fund projects like the RFK Bridge, the Cary Tunnel, Throgs Neck Bridge. I think most people would have to spend their entire career trying to do one of these. Try to create 3 playgrounds. I think that's the subject of an actual comedy, right? I haven't seen all of Parks and Rec, but I think that's basically the plot. My wife has told me. He created 658, and the reason is that he was a person who was empowered. Either he empowered himself or he was empowered, I don't really know which one, to go out and run plays. And I've been told by Professor Emil Malitza at UNC that as you take the books that are used in planning school from, I think this is maybe the most popular one, this is editions 1 through 5 or something, that the books become less prescriptive each edition. It starts out with, we as urban planners, we have a mission to fulfill, we're gonna run the play, we're gonna QB this effort, we know what to do, give me the ball, coach, and I'll run with it. And over time, with each edition, largely in response, I think, to stories like this one where someone mows down a neighborhood to put a freeway in that shouldn't have been mowed down, in response to perfectly reasonable overreaches, the idea that anybody would ever have the power to do this sort of thing became anathema, and that shows up literally in the literature that we're using to teach and coach urban planners. And I didn't notice this, but Professor Emil did and mentioned it to me. So, and I think we also see this in other aspects of life, if I can be so bold as to say so. I remember in the past 2 presidential elections hearing many people, not everyone, but many people saying, how did we end up with these candidates? The reason is we go out, unlike in the 70s, when the parties would say, we're gonna sort of use our noggins and we're gonna pick a candidate who we think will win this, we've sort of gone to the absolute masses. Everyone give us your input. And the phenomenon of people being better than an individual is great for picking the weight of a cow at a county fair or something like that. But it's not always great for making executive clinched decisions about the most vexing problems. And so my suggestion, which I would say is sort of the uber suggestion that I have after 3 or 4 years of trying to affect zoning reform, is that when I go to a town and I have a project, I can go to stormwater, I can go to transportation, I can go to individual counselors, I can go to the planning staff, and each of them, for very clear reasons, has a specialty that they're working on. But it is difficult, a la vis-a-vis the Robert Moseses of the world, to go in, for Patrick to go in, maybe Patrick knows who it is, call Patrick, but it's difficult to go in and speak to the town sort of as one and say, is this project a go or not? Should we waste our time on this, or do you think that this is something that you can get behind? And I think that is a loss. So obviously gaming it out, I imagine that there are many political leaders who simply cannot take the position, I'll approve anything that comes in front of me. That's politically perilous. I think there are plenty of urban planners who know what to do, but maybe they're not empowered to do it. That's not my lane. I check the plans, I ensure compliance. It's the council's decision. But as I think about how could something like this happen again, and I don't mean the freeway system, there will always be people to show up to protest the wrong thing. But a committee or an angry mob will not create 658 playgrounds in Shea Stadium and Jones Beach State Park. And so if we want those gaps to close and we want to live in the places that we want to live in, I think you have to have people who have been sort of empowered and deputized to realize those plans within reasonable bounds. So as I'm gaming it out, it just seems to me that you want to sort of lay hands on someone on the staff side, that the council would want to say, this is a person we trust to make executive decisions. Sometimes there are going to be decisions that require judgment, and within reason, we're expecting you to make those. So I'll tell you sort of how this could work. So I recently got site plan comments back. There were 600 comments. This is what 600 comments look like. And they're from different departments, right? And each, on their own, I'm sure if I asked the people who sent me the comments in purple, can you explain these comments to me? They can. They're not seeing the other comments, though. In fact, I could be dead wrong on this, but I don't think anyone is seeing all the comments before I receive them. And the light version of this suggestion that I have here is that this person at the city who I think could be, imbued with a bit more power maybe than anyone has right now, can simply be the person who says, I'm going to look at these 600 comments, or I'm going to look at sort of the advice that we're giving this developer, and I'm going to do an 80-20. And this is something there's precedent for. So in Chicago, I don't know if you guys will know, I think his name is Asif. He was a building inspector, or deputy commissioner in charge of reviewing permits, I guess. And he was a man who was known to be able to say, here's the spirit of the code, here's the letter of the code, and I don't want this project not to happen or to be aesthetically impaired or just otherwise maimed because of a code condition that doesn't exactly meet this condition that we're seeing here in the wild, and I'm going to make the executive decision that we're going to go 80-20 on this and we're going to build this thing. He retired or took a different job, and there was an absolute outcry at City Hall because of the way that people in the business community were able to work with him and find reasonable solutions to move problems forward. Once you have a rule, there's going to be someone who's hired to enforce the rule, and they're going to understand that it's not my lane to change the rule, and that's good. That's the way it should be. But there do need to be people in positions of power who have some of that authority. There's a gentleman in Chapel Hill, Brian Peterson. At my hearing last night, I heard his name referenced, I think, 9 times, one from each counselor. And I think that's a model of somebody who's being empowered to say, this gentleman understands design, and the council has confidence that this person's design decisions are in the best interest of the council, so we're going to refer you to this person, you handle with them, and by and large, we are going to trust this person's judgment. And so now I know who I go to talk to when there's a design discrepancy. It's just an example. So the pro version, what if we empower our new Robert Moses and we want to do even more? Well, what's happened in different communities across the country is that they've said, we want to actually simplify our code and we want to reduce it. So let's talk through a few examples of how that's gone down. You don't want to be Austin on this chart. So Austin spent 10 years, $8.5 million simplifying their code, and they made it 300 pages longer. A lot of litigation, not pleasant. And I will say, the thing that they did is they said, let's invite the entire community and basically all of Metro Austin to advise us on how to simplify this, which unfortunately is not the right thing that you want to do that's not the way to go. Minneapolis, I'd say C+, they have significantly simplified their code. It's about the same length. Denver made a lot of things more administrative. That's something that I know is happening in bits and pieces, different places. Buffalo, top of the pack, they went from 2,000 pages to 350. Now you could argue, well, they started from a terrible position, but think about the effort that takes. In Idaho, definitely an A for effort and originality. The governor in Idaho, essentially a few years ago, allowed the entire state code to expire and then said, let's just add back what we need. So that's pretty advanced. You're going to need the governor on board to do something like that. But these are just different ways that people have attempted to simplify the code to create space and the ability to be more nimble when trying to close some of the housing gaps that we were talking about earlier. So let me end with one story. I have a lot of favorite projects, but this is the site for one of my favorite projects, and I've done everything I can to make it impossible for you to figure out where this site is. It's not in the triangle, that's all you need to know, but this is the entrance just off of Main Street in a really fantastic community. Their comp plan signals the sign that's sort of at the terminus of this view for a redevelopment, and I've been working on it for over a year, and I've been having a real hard time. At sort of the final moment when it seemed like this project was going to go nowhere, I did show a rendering, which I'm going to show you. And developers are often reticent to show renderings because what's one person's taste is not another. We generally haven't designed the building far enough to know for sure. And it just sort of puts our feet in concrete earlier than maybe we'd like to. But here's the rendering I showed for the before and after. I think this is pretty nice. So here's the before and after. I'm on the brink of sending a termination for this project because I don't think it can be approved. And if I went through the town, from town manager through the planners who were in the meetings, through different counselors I talked to, I don't think you'd find one person who would be like, yes, I want to kill this project. In fact, many of them really like the project. But there's something about the system and the cumulative effect. They've said, even though we sort of want this, we think that this is great, we can't. and you don't care about my project in this nondescript town, but if you're an elected official or you are on staff, you probably get into that role because there's something that's on your heart. There's a project that you think is really important. And whether it's my project or yours, if we want to see the triangle flourish and grow, there will have to be projects like this that get approved, which I think means that we have to evolve in how we are, how the decision structure works, and empowering some of the people we have who know what to do to be able to do it. But this is new material, so I'll look forward to hearing any feedback or suggestions you have, but that's the nature of growing here. We understand the problem and trying to find what the solutions are. I can tell you what they aren't because I've been trying it for a few years, but I think there are certainly the people in this room to help us figure out what they are. So thank you.